aphids, ligas, leafhoppers. These pests can devastate a crop. As an expert applicator, there's not a chance you're going to let that happen. You are the first line of defense, a soldier in the war on these pests. While you protect the crops from these pests, you're also a protector of the environment.
The pesticides you use against insects and weeds, if not used responsibly, can make their way into creeks, rivers, and the ocean.
The companies that develop these pesticides have a commitment to protect the environment as well as field workers and applicators, and ultimately food safety for consumers. These companies spend millions of dollars on studies to verify that pesticides meet the highest safety standards. These include short and long-term studies on human health, wildlife, and the environment.
These studies are mandatory and are performed to ensure the safety of people who consume the treated produce and protect the environment from potential impacts. They are also intended to protect the applicators who handle and apply the products. From the study results, each pesticide is given a label approved by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA. This label has specific requirements for everything from the personal protective equipment to field re-entry intervals after treatments and the type of signs to be posted on field edges. It also describes mixing and loading procedures, application directions, and precautions when handling and storing containers. The label is the law governing everything about that pesticide. Think of the product label as the first line of defense for protection of waterways. Be sure to check the label for product-specific mixing and loading procedures, application directions, and precautions.
Successfully delivering quality produce in the safest manner possible is a joint responsibility of the grower, pest control advisor, applicator, and pesticide manufacturer. The grower manages all stages of crop production from planting to harvest. The product manufacturer creates a pesticide label that lists the pest controlled and describes in detail the proper application methods and precautions that are mandated for its use. The Pest Control Advisor, or PCA, is responsible for checking fields and identifying the pests. If needed, the PCA writes a recommendation that encompasses everything from the targeted pest to type and amount of pesticide to apply per acre.
An important part of effective pest management is proper application of pesticides. It's the last step of a decision that began with identifying the pest, deciding on a pesticide that best manages the pest, then setting the proper treatment date that corresponds with the plant growth stage.
After setting up and calibrating the sprayer, the final step is when the applicator climbs into the cab and goes to work.
When everything is done right, the result is beautiful produce that satisfies shoppers with even the highest standards.
There's also a government agency that has high standards for growers. It's called the Regional Water Quality Control Board. This state agency is responsible for ensuring that creeks, streams, rivers, and the ocean are free of contamination. The Regional Water Board regulates cities, factories, and farms. They require growers to pay for monitoring in waterways wherever there are farms on the Central Coast.
Water sampling sites are located in all major farming areas of the Central Coast, including the Salinas Valley, Santa Maria Valley, Santa Ynez Valley, and Watsonville Pajaro. Water is taken from these sample sites to a laboratory where it is analyzed for numerous pesticides, nitrogen that comes from fertilizers, and compost and bacteria that come from a number of sources.
It only takes a small amount of pesticide in a waterway before it's considered to be a problem by the Regional Water Board. Amounts so small that they are measured in parts per trillion. Not parts per million or parts per billion, but parts per trillion.
50 drops of food dye in this swimming pool is 1 part per billion. 1 drop in 20 swimming pools is 1 part per trillion. Think of the Water Board as the highway patrol of waterways. They set a speed limit for pesticides that seems extremely low. For pesticides in waterways, it's like having a speed limit of 14 miles per hour on an open road in the middle of nowhere. You don't have to agree with these low limits, but there are regulatory consequences for exceeding them.
One insecticide that was commonly used to control aphids and other insects on vegetable crops on the Central Coast had a water limit of 14 parts per trillion. It was found too often and in too many waterways above 14 parts per trillion. Today, it's rarely used by growers on the Central Coast. Even if these levels seem really low, these agencies have the authority to set, change, and enforce these rules. If water detections continue for any pesticide that exceeds its limit, the regulatory enforcement agencies will remove the pesticide from the toolbox for controlling pests. That is like losing medicine for high blood pressure, diabetes, or high cholesterol. When a key medicine is lost, it leaves less options for patients. When a key pesticide is lost, it leaves fewer options for ag producers to stop the pests that devastate a crop.
Now we're going to talk about management practices for best protecting you and the environment when handling pesticides and making these important treatments. Just like how you use personal protective equipment to protect yourself when you apply, we're going to review ways you can best protect surface water from pesticide contamination. Your number one objective is never allow pesticides you are applying to enter any waterways, no matter how small the waterway. By waterways, we don't just mean an area where water is flowing. We also mean areas where water could be flowing and will be flowing. For example, drainage ditches and drives next to the crop. All areas that can get wet from rain or runoff created by irrigation water from sprinklers. There are only a few ways pesticides can reach waterways: spray drift, irrigation water running off a field after an application, stormwater running off a treated field carrying soil into a stream or creek, mixing and loading at a site where water and soil could move to a nearby waterway.
Here are some practices that can protect the environment. Be aware of your surroundings. Know the area where you will be applying pesticides. Use a map to identify all the possible pathways to field drains and waterways.
Suggest to your supervisor additional ways to help keep pesticides on the treated field and stop off-site movement.
Make sure your equipment operation and work procedures are precise and controls are fully functional. Be sure you have the proper tools to make equipment adjustments.
One important step that involves the equipment owner is installing a flow monitor device. This allows the equipment operator to have a visual check to ensure material is flowing correctly and a proper application is being made. Another tool for the equipment owner to consider is installing the diaphragm check valves to the hose just before the nozzle, especially if the drop nozzles are being used. A check valve prevents any liquid from dribbling out of the nozzle after the spray boom is shut off.
Now, here are some practices once you are on the tractor. Spray rows of crops adjacent to a waterway only when the wind is blowing away from the waterway. Only turn on the nozzles after you have entered the field. Don't turn the nozzles on before they are over the crop. You don't want to spray pesticides on the drives surrounding the field. Likewise, turn off the nozzles at the edge of the field. Keep the application on the crop and off everything else.
Why is it a problem for a small amount of nozzle dribble to fall on the road when making a turn? Should the road get wet from sprinkler overspray and water leaves the field, it could pick up some of the material left on the roadway and carry it into a waterway.
That may seem like a really small amount dribbling out of a nozzle, but remember, the Regional Water Board is looking for pesticides in field drains at parts per trillion.
Other things to consider. Be aware that too high of nozzle pressure can lead to off-site movement and drift. Driving too fast when spraying can cause excessive drift. Turn off nozzles when the spray boom is over a drain ditch.
Another important consideration for field edge roadways is when insecticides are applied by shanking in prior to planting. These soil treatments are an effective way to control insects and involve placing pesticides in the row using small shanks or knives. These shanks with open-ended lines can dribble small amounts of liquid after being turned off and the rig raised on row turns, a problem that can be solved by installing check valves. These check valves stop the nozzle dribble on row turns.
Operators occasionally like to stop the tractor on the turn road, turn on the shanks with the toolbar out of the ground, and check to make sure none of the nozzles are plugged. Not a good practice. Do that at least 25 yards into the field. Better yet, in the middle of the field, but never on the turn road. That way, the liquid lands in the field where it belongs. Never flush the boom on the drive at the edge of a field or on the mixing and loading site.
Everyone has seen roadside drains and ditches at the edges of fields. Most of the time, these drains are dry or have just a small amount of flowing water. So you might think, what's the big deal?
Well, remember, the Regional Water Board looks for pesticides at parts per trillion, which is like 1 drop in 20 swimming pools. In those field drains with almost no water, a small amount of overspray can easily add up when there is very little water for dilution.
So whether it's spray drift or sprinkler water on roads washing into drains, it's best to take steps to keep pesticides off of these paths to waterways.
When mixing and loading, it's best to do this job at the high end of the field. Take into account the direction of field drainage, then select the best location for the mixing and loading to avoid off-site movement. That way, any minor spills would be washed into the field should there be a rainstorm or sprinkler runoff. Now a review of the key practices for keeping pesticides out of waterways. Always read and follow label directions. The label is the law. Be extra careful when spraying near waterways. Make sure to shut off nozzles at the row end and start spraying only after entering the field. Consider installing check valves on all spray boom nozzles. Mix and load at a site where water and soil can't be washed to a nearby waterway.
By following these simple guidelines for applying pesticides, you play a key role in protecting crops from devastating pests,
stopping any pesticides from moving off the field,
And most important, helping produce beautiful vegetables that families love to eat.